Update 35584 introduces automatic scouting for Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition. The objective of this feature is to ease the early game learning curve. This feature is quite controversial, so let's dive in and take an in-depth look at it. First, we'll examine how exactly the mechanic works, then we'll look into whether it actually does make the early game learning curve easier, and finally, we'll see if it has effects that last into the late game. So, how does this newfangled feature work? On the surface, it's quite simple. Click the scout, click the auto scout button, and watch him go! Or, wait, maybe skip that third step. I think you're not supposed to watch the scout, but instead focus on other things, like not losing villagers to the boar. You can also set a hotkey for this feature in the Military Units tab of the Hotkeys menu. I had a default hotkey of F here, so you may want to go to this menu and change it. It may conflict with the flank formation or with paying respects. Oh, and while you're in that menu, the ungarrison hotkey, as well as the gate and zoom hotkeys, have also changed, so you may need to reset those as well. Anyway, back to the scout. As it starts running around the map, it doesn't fight back or attack any enemy units. If it's attacked, it just keeps on running, oblivious to whatever horrors are chasing it. The auto scout option is available only for the starting scout, and not for scouts that we train later from a stable. On one hand, this makes it so that we can't abuse the mechanic in the late game and have something like 20 hussars auto-scouting around the map. But on the other hand, it also makes the auto-scouting feature kind of awkward to use after the Dark Age. If we select a group of scouts, then the interface that is presented in the lower left comes from the final scout that is selected. That means if we first select the starting scout, then shift-click a trained scout, we don't see the auto-scout button. But if we select a trained scout, then shift-click the starting scout, we do see the auto scout button. This behavior is awkward at best, and is where the mechanic starts to break down. If we dig deeper, there actually are situations where players may have more than one auto scout. Maps such as Budapest and Metropolis have multiple TC starts, and each player starts with one scout per TC. Each of these starting scouts has the ability to auto explore. If we select a group of these scouts, then we can't just click the auto explore button to get them all scouting. Only one scout starts moving when we click the button or press the hotkey. We can start all of the scouts moving by selecting each individually and ordering them to auto-scout. We might want each scout to explore around each of our individual town centers, but that's not what happens. Actually, the scouts don't seem to spread out or move independently. Rather, they all try to follow a similar path. I guess the AI scouts probably have a similar limitation that just isn't as easy to notice when we don't have vision of those players. The other place we can use auto-scouting is in the campaigns, and again, we run into the awkwardness of multiple units being able to auto-scout. Every unit in either the scout line or the eagle line that is placed at the start of the scenario has the auto-scout ability. That means you can take a whole bunch of units and just have them all auto-scout. The scenarios certainly weren't designed with this mechanic in mind, and it can look a bit ridiculous to have 16 units all moving by themselves instead of being commanded by the player.
Saladin, where are you going with that great army?
Oh, silly Egyptian Caliph. Not even Saladin knows where this great army is going. I know the stated goal is to help new players in the Dark Age, but other than restricting the feature to the starting scout only, it seems like auto-scouting wasn't fully thought out for other areas of the game. There are lots of weird quirks and UI glitches that appear if you go beyond the obvious use case of a single Dark Age scout. It feels like yet another example of a Definitive Edition update being pushed out while still buggy and not properly finished. But now for the big question. Is this mechanic actually a good way to help out newer players? Remember, the original goal is to help players begin playing ranked games. And this question is an important one to ask. Scouting can definitely be a daunting task for new players to learn. I'm sure many of us typed in the Marco and Polo cheat codes simply because we didn't want to be bothered to scout the entire campaign map. But I think scouting being difficult, and perhaps even more so in the Definitive Edition, is a symptom of two bigger underlying problems. Aoe2's Dark Age is slow-paced, and DE's matchmaking doesn't include new player settings. First, let's talk about the Dark Age. You can see the evolution of Dark Age scouting through the Age of Empires series. The original game just gave you villagers at the start. Then, Aoe2 introduced a dedicated scouting unit. Age of Mythology then gave various scouting mechanics for the different civilizations. The Greeks have a standard scout, but also a flying Pegasus unit. The Egyptians have priests to build obelisks for scouting. The Norse have infantry that can construct buildings while scouting, and the Atlanteans have oracles who scout by, well, by standing still. And finally, Aoe2 created a dedicated hero unit as an explorer. The treasures scattered about the map set up a reward system for scouting, where you're rewarded with extra resources or bonuses. It gives a set of mini-games to play so that you can fight treasure guardians instead of just going about a mechanical Dark Age build. Putting laming aside, scouting in Aoe2 is about as basic as it gets, with just a scout and no gimmicks. That's not to say the mechanic is shallow. By all means, there is an incredible amount of depth and skill to be learned about Dark Age scouting, but it does mean that, on the surface, the nuances that, to an experienced player, may be exciting, are not apparent readily to new players. Now, the Aoe2 Dark Age is something that isn't going to be changed anytime soon. There were attempts such as the 6 Villager Start or the Empire Wars game mode, but nothing really captures the same gameplay experience of the standard 3 Villager Start. Starting from almost nothing, then exploring and growing your empire is how the game is designed to be played.
You start from humble beginnings, a small village in the Dark Ages. You explore to expand your borders, conduct trade to boost your economy, and research technologies to grow your civilization into a mighty empire.
But I worry that if players don't need to control their scout, then the Dark Age may become even more boring. I've experienced enough games where I've lost my scout to know that the most boring part of the Dark Age is when we don't even have a scout to control. There's pretty much nothing to do when the scout is dead and the feudal age is taking seemingly 5 ever to research. Controlling the scout at least gives players something active they can do, when they otherwise might just be waiting around doing nothing. Idle villagers are bad, but idle players are even worse. The Dark Age is already the least action-packed part of the game. Automatic scouting removes the key element of strategic decision-making that characterizes it, in many ways defeating the purpose of even having the Dark Age to begin with. If we want to make scouting easier in the Dark Age for new players, then we should start by examining what solutions there were before the Definitive Edition. If you're just playing single player, then there are the Marco and Polo cheat codes. Don't feel like exploring the map? Then just make the map visible. Considering how cheat codes tend to be one of the first things that people remember about AoE2, I think this is a system that works rather well. It's an assistant that's there whenever you want it. Except, of course, the cheat codes don't work in multiplayer, unless you want to troll your friends with cheat units by trying to hide the fact you enabled them. As far as multiplayer goes, there are 2 standard solutions to the scouting issue that are used by new players. They're called Black Forest and Green Arabia. If we look at AOCUX.com, we see that these are 2 of the most played maps. Black Forest is played on the Explored setting, so there isn't a need to scout and find resources, and Green Arabia is a special version of Arabia where the starting resources are closer to the town center. It's easier to lure boar and to find sheep, so trying to control a scout while executing a build order isn't as difficult. We won't need to adapt a build to missing sheep since we're almost guaranteed to find them quickly. And that brings us to my second problem with scouting in DE, that the matchmaking system doesn't let new players play the settings that new players most commonly play. Sure, they can play on Explored Black Forest and matchmaking, but the most common setting for BF is a 4v4 team game, where there's only 1 map ban per player. Even if players want to play BF, they'll have to sit in a queue with other maps such as Alpine Lakes, where they may have to play maps such as Nomad or some versions of Mega Random that don't even give them a scout or allow them to follow a basic build order as a getting started guide. Auto-scouting could help players adapt to a wider variety of maps. Perhaps it lets them play normal Arabia or Gold Rush or some other maps more easily than they could have previously. But I question whether automating such an integral part of the game is a better solution than simply supporting more new player-friendly settings. If someone plays Mediterranean, then they can't just reuse the build order they learned for Arabia, and they can't even rely on the Art of War tutorials, since they are intended for a very different type of game. The way the map pool is set up, players are forced to jump into maps that have no tutorial content teaching them how to play. Auto-scouting isn't changing the need to come up with a different build order, or changing the requirements of adjusting to different starting resources. It could even make it more difficult to adjust to these maps, as if players don't scout and see that their resources are different, they may not even realize the need to adapt to the situation. The tutorial should be expanded to teach players both how to scout and how to play on different maps. That way they're not just thrown into deep water on maps for which they're not prepared. If you still want variety in the map pool, you could make Green Arabia type versions of all of the other maps. let players play with resources closer to their town centers before they're ready to move on to more advanced settings. Players can still be given a friendly environment in which to start out, without replacing one of the key aspects of the game with automation. Let's put that to the test, though, and see how much of the Dark Age actually can be automated with the Autoscout feature. To see how it works in a real match, I played a game with Ornlu, where we both agreed to keep our scout on Autoscout for the entire game. Despite the color selection in the menu not working, the Autoscouting did work. The scout does an okay job of making an initial circle around the town center, but after that, it becomes very inefficient, just blindly scouting instead of making intelligent decisions. Rather than trying to scout my woodline so I know where to place my lumber camp, it prioritizes running around in the unexplored territory. After finding my sheep, it doesn't bother to pick them up. The second sheep is visible clearly in the fog of war, but the scout just ignores it and keeps moving. We are, of course, taking this example to the extreme, and a human player could pick up the sheep, then start auto-scouting again, especially since in this specific example, the player receives a notification when they capture the sheep. But even worse, Ornlu's scout runs forward to scout me without finding all of his sheep. The scout seems to have some basic ability to avoid the town center, but then I can cheese it by building a quick wall. The scout doesn't try to avoid the arrow fire, but instead runs directly underneath the TC. By the time I've reached the Feudal Age, my scout still hasn't found Ornlu's base. It decided to scout the corners of the map, and essentially scouted my entire half of the map, rather than doing something intelligent and moving out in a circle to find my opponent. I learned where Ornlu's base is because my scout finally finds the sheep that his scout missed. Again, this is a place where a human player might take control and, once their own base is scouted, start moving the scout around the rest of the map. Overall, in the early game, my initial assessment is that the Autoscout does a decent job in the first 2 to 3 minutes of helping to find starting resources, but after that, it becomes incredibly inefficient. And that's how the announcement post advertises the feature. Manual scouting will still be a lot more intuitive and accurate when it comes to understanding your opponent's strategy and the map layout early on. But I think we need to step away and question whether creating a feature that is, by design, inefficient actually is a good idea. One of the first things I teach new players is not to use waypoints when scouting, but instead to become comfortable setting a control group for the scout and switching between the scout and the town center. It's a basic skill you need for later on in the game, when you go to manage your army or keep track of the villager who's hunting a boar. Now, if someone wants to get better at the game, my advice is going to be not to use auto-scouting, but just like before, to practice both controlling the scout and making decisions about how to move it. Developing a nice Dark Age rhythm is incredibly important, and you can still do this even on Green Arabia, and this map has no effect on high-level gameplay since those players are playing different maps. But how might auto-scouting affect high-level players? Let's move on to the late game. While the auto-scouting is weak early on, it feels strong later on. Back to the game I played with Ornlu, I noticed that the scout, which I deliberately left on auto-scouting and didn't command directly, ended up being very useful. It scouted the back of Ornlu's base and showed me where there was an opening in his walls. Then later on, it discovered all of the extra gold and stone piles on the map. Ornlu lost his scout, and he needed to build outposts to find those resources. And despite my scout running around trying to get to the remaining patches of black area, Ornlu never actually killed it. When he moved out to take one of the extra golds, I saw him because the scout ran past his mining camp foundation. Everything the scout did, I could have done myself, either by being smart and paying attention to the scout, building outposts in the corners of the map, or palisade scanning to check for the mining camp. But it feels significantly less satisfying for the scout to do this for me. Finding the extra golds is something that should be meaningful, especially if your main golds have run out or are being denied. Think about how excited the Scottish narrator gets.
Good! You found some gold!
Even expert games can be decided when one player is fighting desperately for control of gold in the middle of the map, just because they don't see the safe gold that's one tile outside of their line of sight. It's less fun for me to look at the minimap and just see where my golds are because the scout happened to run past them. Ornlu was fully walled, so my scout didn't have a way to run into his base, thus it just kept scouting the outside part of the map. I didn't spend resources walling the front of my base near my ranges, so his scout was free to run straight into my base, leading to it getting killed. It feels unfair that one scout would survive while the other would wander blindly into the opponent's base and get killed. Scouts can be strong in the Feudal Age, but they lose most of their value once Knights and Crossbowmen come out. Bringing one scout away from our army to scout, after it's lost most of its fighting ability, seems like it can be an uncomfortably strong task to automate. Overall, for the very basic task of Dark Age scouting, the feature seems to work okay. But as we dive more than just skin deep into the mechanic and explore beyond the single Dark Age scout situation, auto-scouting really starts to break down. It feels like it's hacked together and tacked on, rather than well thought out and thoroughly tested. To me, it seems like an attempt to address the symptoms of more serious problems, rather than an effort to deal with those issues head on. Now, I don't think it's necessarily bad for all players. There are certainly people who just want to play single player without worrying about scouting. Even something as extreme as using an economy management AI script and co-oping with the AI so the player controls only the military while the AI controls the economy sounds like a really interesting project that would be enjoyed by lots of people. But this level of automation is something that shouldn't be the standard presentation to players for how to play the game. As far as getting players started with multiplayer is concerned, I don't see it doing anything for the early game that isn't already done by Green Arabia or by the Explored or All Visible settings. Those solutions have no impact on high-level gameplay, since the players simply play with different maps and settings. It's certainly possible to sit back and have a casual, relaxing game without the auto-scout feature just by using these different settings. It remains to be seen whether high-level players find any use for it, and whether new players actually find it helpful for them to learn the game. For better or worse, the Definitive Edition now has this feature. There definitely are still some bugs and quirks that need to be worked out, and we're going to have to wait and see how people adjust to using it. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.